Coming up on Chopper's Political Podcast.
By May, we have to come out with an absolute firm immigration policy. Otherwise, we're going to be slaughtered in the May elections.
Wow. Welcome back to Chopper's Political Podcast with me, Christopher Hope, GB News' political editor. Weekly, I bring you the best guests, gossip and stories from our studios at GB News in the heart of Westminster. MP's main job is passing laws, keeping us safe, helping the economy to grow. Most add to the pile of other laws already accrued over hundreds of years in our country, but there are very few ideas, policies, laws which break real new ground. In effect, they are called threshold bills. One of those is the Assisted Dying Bill. It aims to provide a way for people who are suffering from disease to kill themselves. It's being seen as momentous as the abortion legislation in the late 1960s, and the debate over it in the House of Commons this week has been intense and spirited. So on this week's podcast, we'll be examining what this bill proposes to do and discussing whether it should in fact be passed into law with a supporter and a critic. Plus, I'll be talking to the two journalists behind the book, which everyone is talking about in the pubs of Westminster this week. It's called Get In, The Inside Story of Labour Under Starmer by Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund. And with all the chatter about Reform UK and the Tory party merging, who better to ask for their opinion than Sir Edward Leigh, the father of the House of Commons. First, to assisted dying. Now, this bill was voted through by MPs at a second reading so far. It proposes allowing adults over 18 who have mental capacity and are terminally ill and are in the final 6 months of their life to ask for help to die. They must have a clear and settled and informed wish to end their own life, according to the legislation, and have reached this decision on their own, voluntarily, without coercion or pressure. That decision must be approved by doctors, two doctors, and a High Court judge. Then the person who wants to kill themselves must make a witness declaration to that effect after 14 days, a cooling off period, if you like. At least that was the plan voted through by MPs at second reading, because it's changing this week in real time, and that's caused quite a row. Later I'll be hearing from Neil Shastri Hurst, a Tory MP and a doctor who supports the changes. But first, joining me today on Chopper's Political Podcast is Nikki DaCosta, a former Legislative Affairs Director at number 10 Downing Street and a critic of these plans. Nikki, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast. A long intro, but it's very detailed. I thought setting out for listeners is important, but you're against it. Why?
I didn't start out against it, and I never expected to spend so many hours focusing on this bill. But my job for 4 years in number 10 Downing Street, working for two prime ministers, was to do legislation well, or where you have to go fast, make sure the prime minister does it knowingly. Here we have a bill, which, as you say, that's a wonderful word, threshold legislation. It changes our very relationship with life and death. It's seismic legislation, and it's going through our least robust legislative process, and in a way which seems designed to avoid that scrutiny.
So the government's neutral.
Yes.
Now that matters because it means there's no kind of civil service support behind it. There's no, as you said earlier or before we started here, there's no impact assessment. So we don't know the impact on health service or the judicial system from what we've been imposed by MPs.
Even more than that, there's no policy process. When I was in government, minister says, oh, I've got a great idea. And the officials go and say, right, well, what does that actually mean in practice? And they break it up and then they sub the minister on each element and say, these are the consequences. This is what we talked to about the experts. This is where we think you should go. And there's a real focus on, is every word right? Here we have a bill that's been, as we've told, cobbled together from other jurisdictions. It's not a bill designed for England.
Who said cobble? That's a very pejorative term. They would say using other experts in other countries.
Well, if you take bits of bills, and it's notable, for example, they say it's it's from the Oregon legislation, or they say
in
it's
America,
from
where it's in that state of Oregon, where it's allowed.
Or they say from Australia. But when I go and look, and I'm a details person, I go and look at those acts, there's other safeguards that they've removed. There's bits of conscience clauses that they've removed. It's quite, Oregon, for example, has a stronger need to involve medical professionals, that psychiatrists, etc. So I say cobbled because it's not clear why certain policy decisions were taken by the sponsor to include some things and not others. that policy process is missing. The impact assessment is missing. MPs are going in blind.
Yes. That's because it seemed to be a bill of conscience. There's no whipping by the government. It happened with the abortion legislation, but that has changed a lot since it was passed, hasn't it? That's also slightly worrying for critics.
Yes, but also go back and look at the very detailed records of the time of what happened for that abortion legislation. There was a period of consultation beforehand, a very thorough involving of all the medical councils. They all came forward with their suggestions. They adapted the proposals. There was a pre-legislative process. That's not happened here. So the neutrality is very hands-off. And we saw yesterday in the debate, and I know this is a detail point.
This is in the House of Commons, of course, so it's going through line by line.
Yeah.
You're watching every minute, every spitting cough, you're watching it. Yeah, how are you finding that?
Daniel Francis, who has a learning disabled, a daughter who has learning disabilities, raised the concern that if you have learning disabilities and that the test for whether you can access assisted dying would require the doctor to do everything possible to help you make the decision. That's a requirement of the Act that they're referencing. And the minister said, well, we're neutral on this matter, but it's an adequate legal basis. That's the government's view. It's an adequate legal basis for a decision. So what a terrible way to make law, to say something's adequate. That neutrality leaves the vulnerable very exposed.
Yes, disabled people are the campaigners behind them are against the plans, aren't they? They think there'll be coercion, pressure from family members, overwhelmed by the care they're providing to say, or even if they might feel themselves, I don't want to be a burden anymore.
That's it. There is not a single deaf and disabled people's organisation that supports this legislation.
It came from a conversation between Sir Keir Starmer, now the Prime Minister, and Esther Rantzen in opposition, didn't it? Is that right?
It did.
That's been said before, isn't it?
And it goes back apparently to, if you go through the lead lobbying group's records, they say, that one of Keir Starmer's decision as Director of Public Prosecutions was critical to actually kind of moving this on.
Well, I actually helped him. I was formerly at the Telegraph, the Home Affairs editor, legal affairs editor too, and he was the DPP back in 2008 to 2016, I think it was. But the first term of his time, he developed policy on not prosecuting families who take their loved ones to Dignitas because he felt that was wrong. And there was a policy that the CPS, I think, wouldn't prosecute. But that was his first tiptoeing into politics. So I think he sees this as of origin politics, the Starmer story, when he started off trying to develop this policy as DPP.
And that's really interesting you should say that, because when you look at the policy that he put in place, many would say it's working.
It works. I thought so. Yeah.
There's a compassionate approach. You're not seeing many people prosecuted, and where they are, we're hearing that there's a real concern that people were actually murdered. And so for all intents and purposes. Now, what you have here is saying, well, that's not good enough. But when you say that, and then people are emphasising autonomy and choice,
yes,
I always believe that when my choices can only go so far until they impose on somebody else and where they might cause harm to somebody else, then Parliament needs to be really careful about how it legislates.
Are there estimates on how many people might use this process? That'd be interesting to find out.
It is, and what we see over time is it grows. I think we are looking in the thousands at the moment. I'm actually looking into this in detail, but I think we would be looking maybe at about 5,000 people a year. It's quite substantial.
That's a lot of people using it, and there is a burden. Let's talk about that burden issue. As I said at the beginning, a judge was going to sign off and approve what two doctors had said, the right to die. That's been changed this week, hasn't it? And that's caused a bit of a row.
It has. You have two doctors that you go to who will themselves be naturally favour assisted dying as an acceptable, we had from other doctors saying, is another medical treatment. So you have the doctors, you clear their assessment.
So they approve of doing it.
They approve of doing it. And then the judge is meant to be there to say, hang on, let's take a step back, let's really look at it. It's that interrogation of what's in front of them. Instead, that's been stripped out entirely, and what we have is a panel with a retired judge, which means a volunteer, somebody willing to spend their time on this, or maybe a Casey, or maybe somebody with other qualifications.
It's not even a retired judge.
No, and bear in mind, we're all doing this off the back of a press release. Nobody's been given the text of this amendment yet, which further causes concern.
So
about
it's a
MPs.
panel, three-strong panel of a retired judge and a...
Well, no, there's a retired judge or a KC or somebody with similar legal qualifications is the wording in the press release. I believe a psychiatrist or possibly a social worker. But again, we are blind as to the actual detail. And these are volunteers, people that will be what you might call it. There is an assessor bias. Because they're willing to do this work. And that's a real concern, because this is meant to be for exceptional circumstances, for a very small number of people.
Final 6 months of life, want to do it, and
that's it. But what this might envisage is actually more of a pipeline, a sort of signing off. So it is a really important safeguard. And 60 MPs, I believe, said it was really important.
And it disregards being kept alive, because some people who support this are still alive, aren't they? I mean, people who want this to happen or support measures, they may be kept alive. And it's all sorts of, it's a moral question, the whole thing, isn't it?
It really is. But again, it's when it is and this was the heart of yesterday's debate. Is this a decision like any other medical treatment, their words? Or when it is a matter of life and death, do we need to take more care in how that decision is being taken, the reasons it's being taken, and to really watch for the safeguards which will protect those that are most vulnerable? And there's going to be a tendency to try and make it a simple thing. Don't worry.
Yeah. And Wes Streeting is against it, isn't he?
Yes, he's
the health secretary. He's important. And of course, Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, she was against it, as far as we know. So the two ministers in charge of this sort of area where it might affect our public life are against it. And I think maybe I won't talk for Mr. Streeting, but is the concern that if palliative care is so patchy across the country, if it's bad in a certain part of the country, more people may think, well, I'll just end it now. I mean, so it almost supports government failure in that sense.
It does. And what is so disheartening is the degree to which the committee is not wrestling with the fact that if you don't have genuine choice to choose palliative care, to be supported to live your final months, then it's not a genuine choice. It's not about autonomy. You're being forced down a particular pathway.
Yes.
And that's and that does need to be wrestled with.
Yes.
And so for all the, if you bring all that together, you've got a really poor way of legislating, just not suited to the kind of issue. Matters where the vulnerable are exposed, not being properly dealt with, and a desire to simplify the questions. But we're now in the detail.
Are you against the whole thing, or just the way it's being done?
I actually, I stood in the 24 general election, and I was surprised by how much email I got. I thought, why is this an issue? It turns out there's been an intense lobbying campaign. My position is, I understand the principle, and I support people's right to choose.
That's almost a conservative place.
Absolutely.
Actually.
But as I said before, I have to be cognizant of where that choice might harm other people. And when we are doing legislation this complex, it should be a proper process with proper consultation. And I think that's something all MPs should be uniting around. The fact that half the House is only elected in 2024, I almost feel that's being abused because they've got no depth of insight as to why good legislative process matters. And I think they're waking up. But they will see now, even with this change on just the courts, how safeguards are coming out. It's a different bill from what they signed up to, and it will continue to be changed.
So just finally, it's going through committee stage. There's a third reading.
Yep.
Now, when was the last time a bill was rejected at third reading?
Oh, I wish you'd told me this before. I would have researched it. A very, very long.
I think it's Sunday Trading, 1988.
There we go.
I think that I might be correct on that, but I think it is one of those moments. It could happen in this situation. You think with the change announced this week on judges?
I think not just because of this, but because people are looking at the detail now and saying what you told us, what the spin of what this bill is meant to do, and the safest bill in the world doesn't match the reality of what we're looking at on paper. Yesterday, we spent an entire day on Clause 1 on very legitimate questions. And that sort of suggests again why it's a poor process. I think you could be on either side of this debate and say, not this way. This is a very poor way to legislate. It won't bring the public with us.
Well, Nikki DaCosta, former head of legislative affairs in Number 10 Downing Street, thank you for joining us today on Chopper's political podcast, Food for Thought. Now, the bill might have been proposed by a backbench Labour MP, Kim Leadbeater, but support for it is cross-party. With me now is a Tory MP supporter, Neil Shastri-Hurst, who backs the plans. Dr. Shastri-Hurst, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast. I say, Doctor, you're a surgeon, aren't you?
I am.
So you're a Mister.
I am, but I'm a Neil.
You're a Neil. Neil, welcome. Why do you back this plan?
Look, I draw on my professional experience, but almost also my personal experience. And when I spoke in the second reading of the bill, I talked about how I felt I'd failed some patients. And that is because despite the best efforts of those that are providing palliative care, we can't always, in all cases, get that relieving of suffering right at the end.
And palliative care is end-of-life care. It's the last weeks.
It encompasses end-of-life care. It is not solely end-of-life care. It's a much broader specialty than that. But it does deal with those patients who are in the last weeks and days of their life. But there are some conditions, without being too graphic about it, that mean that whatever alleviation you give, for example, a tumour that is eroding next to your carotid artery, the major artery in your neck, that erodes into that, there is no palliation that is going to make that a pleasant death. And so in that sense, I felt that there have been patients who, despite our best efforts, I'd failed as a clinician and my colleagues had failed, because the hope has to be that people have a good death. That has to be our aspiration. There are different ways of achieving that, and what a good death for one person is different for another. But that has to be the aspiration, and that's the place I'm coming from in supporting this bill.
Unlike a lot of MPs, so you've seen people die. I mean, we've seen parents die. It's what you, as you grow up, you share that experience. But you've seen a lot of people die in this way, I suppose, or in the last days. So you felt the people affected by this legislation is acutely known to you.
And that's, it's an occupational hazard being a clinician. You do see people die, but you're also around their families at the time of death, and you see the impact of what is a calm, good death, and the difference between that and what is a often quite a traumatic experience.
Yes,
to some people. And I've been there when it has been extremely traumatic, and that is painful for the patient who's going through the anguish at the end of life, but also for their family members.
To what extent, though, is the suffering you're describing, or is any of this a failure of government policy? So people think that palliative care is patchy across the country, and somewhere where it's not very good, death might be a better option than go through difficult, poor care, for example.
I don't think it's a binary choice between palliative care and assisted dying. I think this is about getting both right. It's about having choice, in those last days of life, to have autonomy over your body. Now, yes, can we improve palliative care in this country? Absolutely. And we need to be doing that. We can't be just saying that this is an alternative to getting that issue right. But on the other hand, as I said, there are some occasions where whatever you try in terms of palliation, it's not going to alleviate that anguish at the end of life. I use the example of the tumour eroding into the carotid artery, for example. There's no palliation that's going to help with that. And so this is about having good palliative care provision, but also giving individuals the autonomy and choice.
There's agency over there.
Agency over their life. This is a very personal moment.
Yeah.
Very personal moment. And I just fundamentally believe individuals should have that choice. They don't have to take that choice. We shouldn't be forcing anybody to take that choice by nature of the lack of options elsewhere. But they have
no one's against. I think anyone against choice, but the issue is coercion and pressure to take a choice. Maybe. What's your view on this removal of a judge sign-off of this decision by somebody who wants to end their lives?
Look, I recognise that for some people this appears, on the face of it, at first blush, quite a controversial decision. Actually, I think there's a potential for really enhancing the bill as a consequence, because it's not taking away the legal oversight of it, it's enhancing it. It's moving to a panel-based system, which is judge or lawyer-led. You've got a psychiatrist, social worker.
So it's a three-strong panel.
Three-strong panel. You've still got that third layer of scrutiny. You've got the two stages of the assessment with two independent doctors. You've then got a panel. So you haven't lost any layers of scrutiny. But it's not dissimilar to things we do with medical tribunals, employment tribunals, where they have a panel, which is judge-led, and perhaps an HR member and a wing member. This is not a unusual forum within the the legal world. I think it's a more robust mechanism because actually you're bringing more experts together to make sure that this has been done with a very clear mind and a very clear intent.
Are you content with the neutrality of the government? It means there's no impact assessment. Nikki DaCosta, who was on before you on the podcast, she thinks that maybe 5,000 people may end their lives this way. Do you have a figure on that?
I've heard a figure of about 5,000-6,000. I think that's probably the ballpark we're in. Look, the government have set out the reasons for not doing an impact assessment at this stage. There are arguments for and against. Inevitably, the bill will be refined as we go through the committee stage. And therefore, there is a cogent argument for saying, right, let's get to that stage, do the impact assessment, be further amendments at report stage, and then we get to third reading where that impact assessment can be updated. But it was probably putting the cart before the horse to do the impact assessment prior to the bill committee because there's likely to be some not insignificant evolution of the bill as it goes through.
So do that at third reading, which is the final moment when MPs get a say on it.
Well, I think it could happen after the bill committee stage,
Okay,
as it's going to report stage.
A report stage and get that done. Would you have done this? Would a Tory government have done this? I mean, I think it's not a political issue, is it really? But a party political issue, but it's political, but not party political. Would a Tory government have done this?
Well, this is a private member's bill, so the government.
Yeah, indeed, the government isn't doing it. But it seemed to be a Labour policy because I think Sir Keir Starmer supports it. I suppose. That's
yes,
part of it.
and historically, when he was leader of the opposition, he suggested that he was in favour of it.
And as DPP did guidance, as I mentioned earlier on the podcast.
Indeed, but it's not the government that support this piece of legislation. It's come through as a private member's bill, which is not atypical with these issues of conscience. But you know, there is broad support across Parliament. Clearly, you know, that differs slightly from party to party, but I don't think this is a party political issue at all. I think this is very much one that we will all come to our individual choices on. I've always said there's not a right or wrong answer to this. There's where you sit on this debate, and we will all have our particular reasons whether we support it or don't. And
the bill could be, if it becomes law, could be changed going forward, couldn't it? The abortion legislation from the 60s is different to what was passed originally.
Yes.
It can evolve too, I think.
Legislation can evolve. I mean, it will require the primacy of Parliament to do so. And so I don't think this is opening a floodgate, which is a concern of others, that this will change shape significantly. That will require the will of Parliament. That is a perfectly reasonable thing because Parliament reflects society as we go through. So where Parliament sits now is very different from where it may be in 50 years' time.
There aren't many doctors like yourself, are there, in Parliament with experience of the actual people being affected by the legislation, are there?
There's more doctors than you think. I mean, I can think of a couple on, 2 or 3 on the Labour side. There's about 4 on our side, 4 or 5 on our side. So I think Parliament benefits from having that experience.
Yeah.
I bring the additional aspect of being a lawyer as well, who did healthcare law. So I've got a certain degree of understanding from both the legal aspect and from the medical aspect.
Yes,
thankfully bringing the theoretical side of it, but also the practical.
And as I say, just finally on this, you've been with people at the end of their time, and they have said to you, "Can you make it end quicker?" Have they?
Yeah.
How do you speak? You say, "I can't." Legally, I can't.
I can't. I can make you as comfortable as possible, but it's difficult. It is difficult, and there are certain patients that stay with you, and there is a graveyard in my mind of those that I felt I let down.
Yeah, because you couldn't.
Because I couldn't. I could do the best I could, but that didn't necessarily stop their suffering.
Yeah, I can see you're moved by that. That's stays with you. That
it does stay with you. I think most doctors, in fact, I think all doctors will have those patients that really remain in their mind, and you carry them through with you.
But the point is, you want to do right by them and do your best you can. And this is what this law. I suppose the point is, if it's scoped too widely, it becomes a problem for the critics like Nikki DaCosta. But if it's aimed directly at the people you're thinking of now, it can really improve their end of life.
Absolutely. I think the key is not to overcomplicate legislation. Invariably, the more complicated it becomes, the more unwieldy it becomes, and it's just bad law. I think if we can keep it fairly straightforward, fairly simple, trust doctors to use their clinical skill and acumen. Chris Whitty picked up on this point.
Yes.
Don't allow it to become a bureaucratic thicket, I think was his rather nice turn of phrase. I think that is important to make sure that this is workable legislation.
Well, Neil Shastri-Hurst, thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts as a doctor and someone dealing with end of life who knows exactly who this bill would affect. Thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Neil Shastri-Hurst, thank you. Now, I'm old enough to remember when Andrew Rawlsey's book, Sermons of the People, blew the lid off Labour feuding in Tony Blair's government in the late 1990s. But that was in the last century, listeners. And a comparable book has been published this week, which lifts the lid on the Starmer government. It's called Get In, The Inside Story of Labour under Starmer. And its authors, Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund, are with me now. Patrick and Gabriel, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast. Great to see you here. It's a fascinating book. When did you first tell Keir Starmer you were writing it?
Well, we told Keir Starmer's team in December 2023 that having written a book on Corbyn, which they all very much enjoyed, I think, inside Downing Street, that we were going to give the same treatment to Keir Starmer and, as you say, the Labour Party under his leadership. They weren't terribly enthusiastic, and there were varying degrees of enthusiasm for various members of the team over the past year. But it was a year from those first conversations with the Prime Minister's team, or the leader of the opposition's team, as he was then, to the day. A year later to the day, we sent it off to the printers, and here we are now.
Wow, and it set the hairs running. Gabriel, to what extent do you think Keir Starmer is really an accidental Prime Minister, in a sense that it really should be West Streeting, and he was meant to halve the majority that Johnson set and take over at the end of a second term? Just this week, in down number 10, when Streeting emerged from Cabinet, someone shouted, "Morning, Prime Minister," and he enjoyed that one a bit.
I bet he did. I mean, look, I think in some ways he is, and in some ways he isn't. When he was caught to power in 2020, many believed because of Johnson's gravity-defying majority that he would be a transitional leader. Yeah. And people saw that he was wooden. He thought he was wooden, as we reveal in the book. He retained the services of a voice hitch. He's not a natural politician. And there were those, especially when at his nadir he was losing by-elections, it looked like Boris Johnson might not yet have even reached his electoral ceiling. So there were those who thought, well, if the best thing that Starmer does is stabilise our party, remove the anti-Semites, that would be a job well done, and we'll rebuild.
A Kinnock job, basically.
Kinnock job.
Before Blair took over.
Exactly that. The other dimension, the other way in which he's transitional is we have depicted his relationship with this man, Morgan McSweeney, his chief of staff. And I'll try to be brief because your listeners don't have endless time to relitigate the whys and wherefores of Labour criminology a decade ago. But this McSweeney man was essentially contemplating how to bring the party back into the centre. And he in quite a calculated way, was thinking, well, who could do that? Who could win over the members and who could in due course win power? And he thought that Starmer, having been loyal to Corbyn, but with his very distinct story, he had this idea, McSweeney, he could tell the public, Corbyn sympathised with terrorists, Keir locked them up. He thought, well, this could be my guy. And the book really is a story of that partnership.
Yeah, he's pretty mean, isn't he, though? He says he's Keir from HR. I mean, you've got Rachel from Accounts, which some thinks is a sexist thing to say, but Keir from HR was one of the lines in the book, Patrick.
Well, yeah, at a very low moment in 2021, just after Keir Starmer lost the Hartlepool by-election, listeners may remember the big blimp of Boris Johnson that was flying over the Tees after that famous by-election victory.
That's right.
It looked like Keir Starmer was doomed and the Corbynite left were going to come back. There was a really fraught period of a month as they waited to fight another by-election in Batley against George Galloway. And during that period, there were a lot of internal doubts about Keir Starmer, whether he had the stomach for the fight. And Morgan McSweeney, during that period, a very good friend of his told us, he'd been speaking to him and said, Keir is like an HR manager, not a leader. What is the point of circling the wagons around this project as, Angela Rayner's over there, the Corbynites are over there, all looking to do him in. If you can't last, that was what Morgan McSweeney said. Obviously, we all vent privately about our bosses. Obviously, we never do. We've got great bosses. But, it's, those sorts of fruity comments about Keir Starmer have not been denied.
No, well, it kind of fits him. That's the problem. It has an element of truth to it. I think Keir Starmer, Gabriel, is a bit unknowable, isn't he? So, his private life is very much private. We don't know who his children are. We don't see much of Lady Starmer. I mean, we think back to previous prime ministers, certainly Gordon Brown's wife,
Sarah was out there doing her own work in charity. Sherry Blair was a practicing barrister. We know all about Sam Cam. I think Samantha Cameron. I mean, we don't really know a lot about him, do we? So people project onto him a bit.
That's quite right. I mean, he is a pretty unusual thing in politics. He's a latecomer, so he's not conversant in the factional vocabulary of the Labour Party, nor the social universe that is Labour politics. And he doesn't want to be part of it. And for that reason, a lot of his own MPs find him quite a bewildering proposition. Now, I always try and temper this with the fact that, well, maybe that's normal. Maybe it's reasonable that he plays five-a-side and has actual friends who he'll go for a pint with, and that those people are distinct from those he sees in his workplace. But it is unusual for politics. And it's true that he has struggled to connect emotionally at times. I don't want to keep getting back to this voice coach who, despite all the hullabaloo generated by their meeting during lockdown, I must confess we only dedicated one single sentence to it in the book, so she's not a big character, but I think it is revealing he spent 5 years under the tutelage of somebody whose job was helping him to connect emotionally, is trying to exhibit a bit more of himself. People do say that even though you can't quite get down to, it's very difficult to put a fine point on exactly what the essence of Keir Starmer is, that off camera he does connect more. I don't claim to be a great personal chum of his, but having met him a few times.
Well, he's a very decent guy. When my dad died, he sent me a text. Wasn't expecting that. It's interesting. He does that kind of thing. Patrick, I've always thought that his issue is he's not a people lawyer. So he's not a jury lawyer.
Yes.
He was a judge's lawyer. So he convinced people of the case or something, but not people of an argument. And that has been his problem from the beginning.
I think that's really, really insightful. If you speak to people who know him from the bar in the 80s and 90s and noughties, they say the same thing. He's not a winner of hearts and minds. People may remember lawyers like
Blair.
Like Blair, simply. Criminal lawyers. He was all about quite fiddly legal arguments and, trying to use the law to win sort of arguments and make progressive change as he saw it. Now, you can tell that in his sort of style. It's very deliberative. He doesn't do soaring oratory. And maybe, as you say, that's part of the reason.
And he's not good, maybe on his feet also. I mean, I've asked him some questions recently that have caused him problems. Like, will you guarantee Rachel Reeves is your chancellor for 5 years? That became he wouldn't answer the question, could he? And it was repeated by somebody else, and it became a headline. I think he's less good at the kind of the nimble-footed thing that you might get in a criminal case. Maybe that's where it stems from.
No, I think that's fascinating. I mean, he is not as fleet-footed as one might imagine, not just in the moment, by the way, and you're quite right that your question, you had a great wobble and needlessly generated an afternoon of questions about a fundamental relationship to this government's success, but also politically. I mean, you do think at times there are sort of obvious things that you think if you were a political animal, a political actor, you would foresee, preempt and address. Things like Patrick and I last summer revealed the passes for glasses story. This was this idea that Wahid Ali, this donor, was sashaying in and out of Downing Street, funding the Prime Minister's clothes, funding his wife's dresses. And you think, well, you're the guy that got into office on not having inappropriately close relationships with donors. You're the guy who, now this has been exposed, is inexplicably incapable of justifying it.
How do you explain that blind spot on their own activity? Do Labour politicians think that we are just trust us, we're good people, we're not like the Tories, and yet they do the things the Tories did?
I think there is a bit of that, and when we published the story, when we broke the story about Wahid Ali having a Downing Street pass, I remember lots of Labour people said this is the most normal thing in the world. But you remember when Lord Brownlow and people like that were coming into Downing Street for Boris Johnson by dint of their status as donors, even if they were big Tory activists, the Labour Party was furious. And I think it's also a case of Keir Starmer not much liking politics. There was Wahid Ali, by all accounts a very generous man, devoted to the Labour Party, basically saying there's loads of tedious stuff about politics, logistical stuff, hiring staff.
The people stuff.
Yeah, the people.
Which is difficult to do.
Yes, and I can make it go away, and you like me, Keir, so I'll do it. To which Keir Starmer is obviously going to say, yeah, I hate that stuff, thank you very much.
And then they're caught short. And then I thought also, I think for me, one of the big problems there was delaying the budget for 11 weeks. It meant there was no narrative for the government through that period. And then the narrative was set by probably the Southport riots, and also I think, and then their response to the Southport riots, and Freebiegate. I mean, was that one of the things you found out for the book? You thought, we can't hold this. I always wonder how much you hold back for your editor of the Times and Sunday Times, and how much you put in the book.
Well, there is a bit of a firewall. There's certain conversations are book conversations. You just wish.
So when you meet them, you say, "This is the book," but I might have to use that.
You're going to have to forgive me, but this needs to go now. Now, to be fair, especially at a Sunday newspaper, every Tuesday is an existential crisis.
Yes.
There are times where you just wish, are you sure I can't use Angela Rayner calling Prince Andrew a nonce this week? But that's the self-discipline required of very serious authors like that.
You park it away, don't you? He's ruthless, though, isn't he? We're seeing this week 12 councillors suspended over the Trigger Matimbers WhatsApp group. He does seem to act when he has to. He's lost 3 ministers since November. I mean, I think even the one at the weekend, Andrew Gwynn, didn't get a letter. I mean, he's getting more ruthless.
And this is the flip side, by the way, of
Patrick
not being political. It is, what would be the political thing to do? Take Jeremy Corbyn's suspension. The political thing to do there would be to, what they did initially, which was let's get round the table with Len McCluskey and the rest of the hard left. We'll strike a deal. We'll let Jeremy back in because we can't blow this up. What would the political thing be to do after Hartlepool? It would be let's change course. Let's, the left are on our back, so we'll bring them in the table. Because Keir Starmer travels light, he doesn't have all that ideological baggage. He doesn't feel obliged to do things other Labour leaders would, which would be to sort of, compromise. He's very prepared to be ruthless and say to people, I'm not putting up with that.
Yeah.
Go away.
And John McDonnell, I think, is still suspended.
Yes, exactly.
After voting over the two-child true benefit.
Yeah.
Last year. And did you just finally get Gabriel Progrand? Is he enjoying the job?
I've heard one thing about him, which is that he does enjoy being Prime Minister. He wants to be PM, and I think
Likes travelling, we know that.
Likes travelling.
He's away a lot.
As Patrick's columns have remarked upon, and at some point I will do more than just pay tribute to Patrick's excellent insight in the Times and indeed generally. But I think he the other day compared Starmer to Cameron in that sort of, why do I want to be Prime Minister? Well, I think I'd be quite good at it. I think Starmer has this sense that he's good at the job, he looks the part. He wanted to be Prime Minister so badly that when Ed Miliband's leadership dangled a peerage before him, the answer conveyed via emissary was, no way, Keir would only ever go...
He's got a second act after DVP.
He's got a second act. And I think that he's fulfilled his sort of life's destiny in some ways, the perceived destiny, but I don't think that means he enjoys the culture of SW.
Well, he did say he prefers Davos to Westminster. I know that was a throwaway line on that the Newsagents podcast, but I thought that was absolutely telling.
It can't be the most revealing. Yeah,
it really was telling.
Yeah,
talk to sort of like-minded people, I thought. And Patrick, just finally to you, how long has he got? So how old is he now? He's 61, is he? So he's 65 at the election. He's getting his bus pass. Is he going to do 10 years? Will he be 70 when he quits? Because I think the question of age is an issue for the next election because of Farage being the same age, Kemi Bade not being 45 at the next election. I think age and who's the future and who's the past is fascinating.
Well, completely. And I think an under-remarked upon thing is that if Keir Starmer is 65 and he's not enjoying the job a huge amount and he thinks he's going to lose, if you look back at Keir Starmer's career, Keir Starmer's life, he tends to say when he's not enjoying something or when he thinks it's pointless, and because he has no great love for politics, he tends to say, you know what, that's fine. Thank you very much. That's me done. And I wonder if that's quite likely if Labour's woes continue in government. But as far as people inside Downing Street are concerned, even some of those we've quoted as being critical or salty towards him, I think they know he's the only show in town for the foreseeable future in the Labour Party.
Well, Patrick Maguire, Gabriel Progrand, thank you for joining us both. The Wood and Bernstein of our Westminster political journalism team, thanks for joining us on Chopper's Political Podcast. Great to have you in the GB News studio too.
Thank you. So pleased to be here. Thank you very much. How are you?
Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Progrand, thank you for joining us this week. And finally, the talk amongst Conservative and Reform UK figures in the bars of Westminster is one thing: how will the right unite to defeat Labour at the next election, despite the denials from the leaders of these two parties, Kemi Bade and Nigel Farage, that such chatter will get anywhere? With me now, with his view on this, is the longest-serving MP in the House of Commons, Sir Edward Leigh, the father of the House, a Conservative MP, of course. So, Edward, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast.
Hello.
Great to have you here. I'm going to ask you why you're father of the House, because you've been in the Commons as long as Jeremy Corbyn. Why isn't he father of the House?
Well, I just managed to sign the book in June 1983, 15 minutes before him. So
That's it.
Yeah, I don't think he cares about being father of the House, but that's why I am, yeah.
And the book is the Register of New MPs.
Yeah, so somebody, actually, I wasn't going to bother, but a colleague who's long since lost his seat said, go in now because you might become father of the House 2 years later. And funny enough, the very first MP who signed the book was, guess who, in 1983? Tony Blair.
Tony Blair.
He was, of all the new take. It does say something about his early political ambitions, isn't it?
He was mustard keen, even in 1983.
Yeah,
the white heat of that Tory landslide, of course.
Yeah, well, there was 110 new Tory MPs, and there's only 2 of us left with continuous service in the same constituency. Only 2 with continuous service.
Now, this week in Prime Minister's Questions, you were hoping to ask a question in the House, weren't you? What was that going to be about?
Well, I was going to say that I was there exactly 50 years ago when I walked in to Central Office, and she walked in at the same time, and I was joining her staff. And I was going to say that the mark of a great Prime Minister is an intense patriotism, putting the national interest before, vague concepts like international law, charisma, courage to take on vested interests, and above all, a clear political philosophy. So does the Prime Minister agree with that she had those qualities, and does he? But unfortunately, I wasn't called, so there.
That's a great shame. I think, it was the week for a question on Thatcher's legacy, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And it wasn't picked up by Sir Lindsay Hoyle. But the chatter, fast forward 40 years since you entered Parliament and 50 years since Thatcher became leader, is all about the future of the right. What do you think should happen? The policies of Reform and the Tory party are very similar. I mean, the Reform goes further than the Tories would like to go at the moment, but they're very similar. Why shouldn't they merge to form one part?
Well, the Reform policies don't go any further than what I want to do. I want to have an absolute right to get out of the ECHR, arrest boat people when they land on our shores and deport them. And I want a zero cap on net legal migration. And there are loads of Tory MPs.
What the Reformers say.
Yeah, well, there are loads of Tory MPs who agree with me. So, I mean, our policies are virtually identical. There's absolutely no point in spending the next 3 or 4 years scrapping and then standing against each other in every single constituency. And then Keir Starmer gets back into power with 30% of the vote.
So it's time for a full-scale merger of Reform UK and the Tories right now.
Well, every time I mention this to colleagues, off the record, of course, no names revealed.
Oh, go on, only me in the podcast.
Only you in the podcast. I've never found a colleague to disagree with me. They say, oh, let's give it a bit more time. And I think that's probably fair enough. But, if we're still in this situation in a year or two's time, then we've got to do something, because we can't just stand against each other in a first-past-the-post system. So I would have, at the very least, an electoral alliance that we stand down in, say, 100 seats and let Reform take on Labour, or we have a full-scale merger. And why not?
Well, why not? Kemi Badenoch would say Reform want to burn down the Conservative House. Nigel Farage says they let me down in 2019. That's why not.
Yeah, well, we did let him down. That was very foolish of Boris. He stood down in all the constituencies we won, and he was treated very badly.
And that hurts him.
Yeah, that hurts him. And Boris should at least have given him a peerage and said, Nigel, thank you very much.
Off you go, Nigel.
And we might not have had all these problems since. So we did treat him badly. But, bygones be bygones. That's all the past. And, of course, Nigel says he wants to kill off the Tory party. And, of course, Kemi says she doesn't want to have a deal. But I personally believe that watch this space with the next 2 or 3 years, because the political logic is absolutely inevitable. If we stand it... I mean, obviously, Kemi would hope that Reform is a blip, but it's not going to go away. And even if it went down to the number of votes or the percentage votes it got in the last general election, it would still stuff us.
4 million votes, yeah.
Yeah. So even if it went down to that, it's hard to see how it would go lower. But, of course, if it stays where it is now, where Nigel is wrong, by the way, is in saying that the Conservative Party is finished and he can destroy it. And he's great. He's a great follower of Trump. But Trump didn't destroy the Republican Party. He took it over. So, the Conservative Party has been around 200 years. It's got loads of councillors, MPs, a political philosophy around deregulation and low tax.
Data, they know where voters live.
They know where. So, the thought that reform is going to suddenly destroy the Conservative Party, and we're going to end up with
like Canada in the.
Yes, well, all that happened in Canada's famous case when the Conservatives were reduced to 2 seats is that I don't think Reform Canada won loads of seats. I just think the Liberals won loads of seats. So the general election, all that would happen is that Labour would win loads of general seats.
So when you say 121 Tory MPs, how many of them want to have a merger with Reform?
Oh, I don't know, but
would you have finger in the wind?
Well, I mean, 41 or 44, whatever it was, voted for Robert Jenrick. So I would have thought at the bare minimum there would be 44.
That's a third, 1 in 3 to MPs.
But that it would be the bare minimum.
Yeah.
And if we're still in this bad place in a year or two's time, I think it'll be many more than that.
Maybe half, 2/3?
Yeah, maybe half. I mean, there probably are, to be honest with you, there probably are a third of Tory MPs who viscerally hate Nigel Farage and Reform, which I don't. I mean, basically, I agree with all their policies.
So why not be a Reform UK MP?
Well, why should I? I've been a Conservative for 50, 60 years. The party stands for something. Why defect? I mean, there's no need to. Well, I'm not saying that I should or other people should defect. I should say that we should cooperate.
Yeah. Have they approached you about joining Reform UK?
Well, there's always sort of people sidle up to you, but I think they know that I'm not. I'm too old and idle now to start changing parties. I'm 74 years old. For 41 years, the good people of Gainsborough have elected me, and a very loyal local party. So I can tell you absolutely I'm not going to defect. There's no reason to do it.
No. Well, there is reason. They might bring together the apparent need for a merger that you're describing.
It might.
Because you're the father of the house. You're a significant person.
I think they're overestimating my importance.
Yes, it's a concern, isn't it? I mean, is it an ego thing? Do you need to replace Kemi Badenoch and bring in Robert Jenrick, or somebody wants?
Well, I thought you were going to ask that question, but I've been long in the tooth, and so in many years past, I have been trapped into being sort of anti-John Major.
No, I'm not trapping you. I'm not. Trapping
No. I wouldn't dream you. Of course, you wouldn't want to trap me.
No.
But I have to say about Kemi Badenoch that whoever was leader now would be finding it very difficult. Whether it was Robert Jenrick, even if we could recreate Mrs. Thatcher, reincarnate her,
she'd find it hard.
And I was there with her, working with her in 1975. People would say she's got a shrill voice, she's out of touch, she's on 21% of the opinion poll. So whoever we had as leader at the moment would find it extraordinarily difficult. The truth is that I'm as angry as any Reform voter about our inability to control immigration. A lot of our own people, natural Tories, are furious that we let in 1 million people in our last year of power, and I'm absolutely furious. And when you I was talking to an ex-cabinet minister only last week, and he was saying, we had this meeting, and the education secretary said we've got to let these people in, otherwise universities would collapse. The health secretary came in and said we've got to let these people in, otherwise the health service would collapse.
The agricultural secretary says another fact.
Culture secretary. So, I mean, there was a reason for it, but, that was unforgivable. The fact is that just as between 1970 and 1974, you can see I go back a long way, we lost touch with our base. We lost touch with our base under Ted Heath. And that's why we were murdered in 24. And that's why...
In 74. And 24.
In 24 and in 74, eventually. We weren't murdered as much in October now.
No, there's 2 elections.
But so this is the problem. We have to go back to our roots, and we have to convince people, whoever is the leader, that our policies on immigration are just as strong, if not stronger, than Reform. Then we can start rebuilding our base.
Can Kemi Badenoch do that? I mean, you mentioned Thatcher. Thatcher had time. She didn't have Reform UK biting at the heels. She didn't have Twitter, social media, all the other demands on modern-day politics. Can Kemi Badenoch do this job?
I don't know. I think it's going to be difficult. But she's very spiky. I quite admire her, actually. Yeah. She's very clever. She's spiky. She's a real Conservative. I like all her anti-woke stuff. She's actually started to say the right things on immigration. But, if you haven't contributed, you're not going to get your long-term...
proper policy last week on citizenship.
So already, having said that, she was going to just leave it for months or even 2 years, she's already... Oh, by the way, I'm saying this to her, our whips, everybody, that by May, we have to come out with an absolute firm immigration policy. Otherwise, we're going to be slaughtered in the May elections.
Wow.
And I'm saying that to the leadership, and people are nodding at me. They're not saying, "Oh, that's ridiculous, Edward." I'm saying, "We've got to have a firm immigration policy." As I said, get out of the ECHR, or you don't have to even say that. You say, get out of any of these conventions that prevent us from arresting people and deporting them. You don't have to have Rwanda. But I've studied this very closely. With Afghanistan, for instance, you simply can't deport people to Afghanistan, Syria. So you have to get rid of all these conventions.
That's a big ask of this government, of this Tory party, but they might do it.
Well, otherwise it's survival, isn't it? You have to see, where is the public? Where are our own voters? What are they angry about? And they're absolutely seething when they see pictures on the news every night of people crossing the channel, and then once they arrive here, they're never sent back. And they're housed in expensive hotels. They're never sent back. It's completely ridiculous. And we should not have been so weak. We should have got out of any of these conventions. I mean, we saw about this Gazan thing this week, this Gazan family. Every time we try to do something as a government, some human rights lawyer like Lord Hermer or Keir Starmer would step in and refer to this convention.
Well,
that convention.
Starmer's going to close that loophole, he says.
Well, he's so good. Great.
So he says.
Oh, by the way, this is as bad for the Labour Party as for us.
Yes, it is.
There are loads,
and that's why reform benefits.
There are loads of working class Labour types in the north of England who are equally angry because they've been undercut. They don't like mass immigration, and the Labour Party's got to wake up, just like the Conservative Party.
Just going back to the first question, what are the odds on Reform and the Tories merging to be one party at the next election?
Oh, I think very high. I mean,
odds on
70%, I should think, or if not merger,
a deal of some sort. Yeah. And will Kemi Bain not be your leader in the election?
I have no idea. I wish her well, but I have to say, going back in history, we did burn through 3 leaders after we lost badly in '97 before we got to one who won. So whoever is leader at the moment. And by the way, if Robert Jenrick had won, people would be criticising him and saying he's a Tory boy, he's out of touch.
So it goes on.
Who knows who's going to lead us in the next, but I wish her well.
Well, so Edward Leigh there, Father of the House of Commons, MP for Gainsborough. Thank you for joining us today to mark Thatcher's anniversary, but also some wise words maybe for the party to listen to about the future of the right and the Conservative Party. Thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast.
Thank you. It's been a great delight to be on this podcast.
Now, Sir Edward Leigh, thank you. And thank you to all my guests on the podcast this week. Nikki DaCosta, Neil Shastri-Hurst, Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund. And thank you for listening wherever you are in the world. I tweet at Christopher Hope on X. Are you on Twitter, Sir Edward Leigh?
Yeah, I do tweets, but I don't read the horrible replies.
No, don't read those. I don't read them either. I get them. Email me, chopper@gbnews.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do tell your friends. If you really enjoyed it, please leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It helps other people to find this show. Thanks to the brilliant team, they are brilliant, of GB News colleagues behind this show. Rebecca Nunes, George McMillan, who are here with me in the studio, and Mick Booker and Jeff Marsh, who are elsewhere at GB News HQ. Most importantly of all, thank you to you again for listening. If you want more Chopper in your life, as Edward Leigh does, please do catch me during the week on GB News and keep up to date with our best reporting on our website, gbnews.com. But until next time, have a great weekend. Cheerio!